Coming up, with the 2023 NBA draft officially in the books, we gave out our official grades from Noah Clowney, Dariq Whitehead, and yes, even one Jalen Wilson in the second round. Were there other moves the Nets could have made, and how does it impact the way we look at their offseason going forward? We break it all down coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast. My boy Andy Mack, and credentialed media member for the 2023 NBA Draft. We thank you for making us your first listen. We're free on all those great platforms. And Doug, you did the big lift on the back end of the draft, breaking down prospects, trying to do it on the fly while also keeping an eye on what was happening as the draft continued to play out behind you. Now we get to give our official grades, got the gauge from the fan base as well to try to say, where are we as a Brooklyn Nets organization coming out, at least in the first round, getting two very young prospects?
Yeah, look, we'll get to these grades in 1 second. I have to say, just as one quick just recap of this, draft is just so fun. It's just a fun time. I mean, all the moving parts. This is a pretty chalk draft, all things considered. Not really a ton of surprise, really no surprises, honestly, except for maybe Cam Whitmore. And that I'm not even sure is a surprise. But I just wanted to say one thing that I just never said last night, and you and I never talked because the way the night unfolded. But the draft just in and of itself as a process is awesome. I mean, following along where teams are moving, just waiting for moves, the speculation. I just love the whole thing. So it was a really fun lead up to the draft. I'm so glad I want the Nets to have picks every year. It was just a bummer when the years they didn't have picks. Having two picks made it even better. So fun night all around. You and I are recording this the day after the draft. So a little bleary eyed and hitting the coffee hard here, but that's all right. We wanted to get back on the mic as soon as possible. Anyway, draft grades. So I broke it down for a while last night. I put it out as a poll on Twitter. We'll go to where the sort of the fan base landed here in a second. I would say overall, my draft grade for marks here is like a C+, and I'm encapsulating the whole, maybe B- if we're just gonna round it up make sure the G. Just to be clear,
I'll let you keep going. We did not confirm our grades beforehand. C+ is where I'm gonna go with this, and I think we're gonna end up hitting on similar reasons.
Yeah. So the one thing, we did not say our grades to each other, but and we didn't do a card where we held them up at the same time either. I'll round it up to a B- so mom and dad are maybe can feel a little bit better about it because it just looks a little bit better on the paper. But I'm gonna say C+ because I just think I think it's not even so much around Clowney and Whitehead, honestly, too. It's like an in totality thing here where it just felt like this is a team that needed to do more than just make two speculative draft picks. And just because of the state of where they are now, again, I want to talk, you and I, about Clowney and Dariq, but I just think as a macro top-down view of like what maybe we expected and sort of should have happened with some of the other guys that are on this roster, other picks that might have been available, it just didn't feel. It feels like there was something left on the table, and if I'm being very glass half empty about this, something we talked briefly on the YouTube, it feels like a carryover almost of last trade deadline. Like if I'm gonna like the trade deadline last year, where it felt like, hey, why are these guys still on the team, right? And now I walk away from this draft to some degree having some of those at least similar feelings.
And we're going to talk about what other moves maybe could have been made, should have been made coming up here. So I'm going to save a version of this that maybe makes the grade look higher, and it can end up being more of an off-season grade that we won't even get to fully do, obviously, until everything unfolds here. But to your point, it felt like at least we had anticipated, and a lot of people did, that something was going to happen here. A lot of moving parts were going to happen here. There's a world where the Brooklyn Nets drafted at 23 and 24 instead of 21 and 22, but also moved several contracts, and for that reason alone opened up the possibility of roster spots, the possibility of playing time. So I think a little bit of the way I came out of Clowney and Whitehead being drafted, both very young players, right? And you went over these guys in detail, so we'll circle back on them next week just to continue to dive in where they fit in. But it kind of informed maybe why more moves weren't made. Because these guys are young, which means they're developmental, which means you're banking on some upside opportunities for them. So if we focus in on them just as pure players, you look around the board and where these guys went. Right. They make sense. Cam Whitmore, you mentioned falling. You had talked about Podziemski going a little bit earlier there to the Golden State Warriors. Like when you look at those prospects and the teams that they went to, I think it's the same kind of thing. And then even in behind them, talking about Chris Murray, yes, NBA ready guy. He goes to Portland. We'll get into some other players that I looked at there. So it's hard for me to be too critical about the individual players because a lot of these guys are. Well, let's see. Right. So I don't want to sit here and go, well, these aren't NBA ready contributors at the moment, or we have to see on the injury concern for Whitehead. And so how could I possibly? No, I have to look at it the way I would about any prospect, and maybe ones I liked a little bit more, and say, yeah, if they hit their mark, like you talked about specifically with Clowney, if the shot comes through, great, then this guy's a hit and it feels like a home run. And we're not going to know that for 6 months, for a year potentially. So it's really hard to be anything other than cautiously optimistic around where they came out here.
And I did a bad job there separating. I really should give these two separate grades, right? This is like
player by player.
Not even that, just like micro and macro moves, because the reason my grade isn't lower is because I actually don't mind the draft picks. Right. I'm wrapping I probably should have just started there. I should have just given two separate grades. The grade on the draft picks, I think, is higher than the grade as like the overall draft. I think those are two different grades. And I was wrapped up in trying to give myself a sort of an end of semester cumulative grade that had to be sent home on the report card without actually breaking it down into the steps. In terms of Clowney and Whitehead. Yeah, go ahead.
So let's do the 2-player grades here, and then we'll follow up with that high level view. We'll separate the prospects out from what we think should have been accomplished. So Clowney and Whitehead, how do you feel on them? And by the way, let's go ahead and do individual grades on each one of them, and then we'll know the collective for those players.
Okay, I'm actually, for this one, I'm going to say Clowney B-, and Whitehead, I'm going to say like almost like an NA, like because I think the range of outcomes on him is so wide that I feel unsure about giving a grade to it. But if I had to do it, I would say they're both like in the B- probably range anyway too, right? But this is all operating from, at least with Whitehead, I'm going to admit right now that I don't know what I don't know with him. And so, and we talked about this before with the medical stuff. It's unfair to even give this a grade because we're not able to access sort of like what they can see on the medical thing side. And that's and that might just be literally the whole story. And so if the medicals are fine and we trust that, then it's an A. It's a total A. The guy was the number 2 guy in his class going into Duke. Just to reiterate something we said on the pod, would have gone top 10. If they did the draft last year and high school guys were eligible, he would have been a top 10 pick. Like it just that, right? So from that standpoint alone, maybe you say it's an A. It's just that we just don't have all the information. And that becomes a little sketchy. The Clowney one, it's probably, my grade is a little lower, and I'm just going to stick to what I said pre-draft and try not to get swayed by talking myself into it on the back end because the Nets took him. This guy was not high on the list of guys that I wanted to take here. I probably, from that standpoint, just need to stick to my guns and say like CC+.
Yeah.
And that's just trying to be honest with what I said pre-draft, right? And so, does that make sense? I'm trying to like separate. I realize there's lots of different grades to give here.
And I think once you get these guys, then you think about what they could be, and then maybe to your point, you start adjusting your grade. So quickly for me, if I look at, to your point, he wasn't as high on our board or as high as guys that we would have liked to have seen the Nets come. There's a very particular reason why if I'm grading him out as a prospect, I can call him a B prospect and say developmentally, I like where he can go. In totality of just, we'll talk about on the board, it probably comes down a little bit for me with him. And I look at him more as being a C kind of prospect in terms of at 21 and making that pick for Brooklyn. Whitehead, I'll even go a little bit higher because I'll look at it the way we did saying, if not for the foot injury. Eric Slater reported that Whitehead was speaking with Jason Tatum, also a Duke alum, had an injury on his foot, different area, different, metatarsal, some big, doctor word. I won't act like I know what that is, but that Tatum just referred to Whitehead saying, hey, stay focused on your process and know your body and how your rehab should be. We've seen Jason Tatum has not had injury problems as he's gotten into his NBA career. So if I eliminate the idea that this is going to be a looming issue, and you talked about at length, the doctor obviously in-house for the Brooklyn Nets, I'm going to call the Dariq Whitehead an A, because it means that this is potentially a top 10, top 12 talent in an NBA draft that, if not for the timing of his injury, would have been there, right? On pure talent and skill alone, he would have been a potential lottery pick in this year's draft. The injuries bring him back, and the Nets maybe get a steal. Coming up here in a second, then, let's turn our attention to what is the overall draft grade removed from these prospects, both looking at the draft board around where the Nets picked and the moves that were not made. Okay, so I know I got a little bit in the weeds there talking about Noah Clowney. I'm specifically going to reference the guy that I was incredibly high on. We went over the odds beforehand saying, hey, he fits right in the wheelhouse. A big reason why I'm drafting Noah Clowney lower is because Olivier Maxence Prosper was there and he went at 24. That, to me, if we're just talking about taking guys with a type of skill set and upside and development and whatever, these guys aren't one-to-one comps, I would have taken Prosper. I would have taken Prosper at 21. And if you told me you took Prosper at 21, yes, I'm in favor of him, but I would have graded that pick an A, because everything about his game, I think, translates correctly and the upside is there. That would have been my preference. And because you're at least relatively in the same range of skill sets and potential, I just look at him as being, and he was a riser, right? Noah Clowney was a sitting put in that area. I would have gone that way with it. The Whitehead piece, I can look around the board and say some other options. But does that make sense to you on Prosper specifically before we kind of look a little bit at what some other teams did in this range, which I also find fascinating?
Yeah, I agree. And that's just going to be, this is going to be buyer preference at this point, as we all know in the draft. I'm totally fine with that. Again, I'm trying to stick to my guns as much as possible and also be excited at the same time, because once the guys are stepping into the building, like, this is who you're going to root for here going forward. So you do have to thread a little bit of a needle in terms of analysis, because at some point, denigrating whatever happened in the draft is not going to make sense. And I don't think Clowney's like that kind of pick either. So it's like, we're not even saying that. It's just trying to be honest and fair about opinions we already had and carrying over those opinions into the post-draft process. And, sort of before, as we do a little quick, moratorium, and then we move on. I think in general, I agree with you. I will say, after these guys, like, if I want to give the Nets sort of credit on this, or I do want to give them credit, right? The names, except for OMP after this, nothing else got me too excited. Right now, there's a separate part of this that we're going to discuss here in a second, which is like, where these guys were on the Nets board as compared to some other people. But the list of names after this, I know some people liked Nick Smith a lot. Not actually a guy that I was over the moon over. So I don't think that, like, Nick Smith the draft grade would have been the same, if not lower, if he had been taken for me personally. If I'm just being honest, that was something I said pre-draft. So stick to it. I know Sensabaugh is a guy that people really liked. Maybe you can talk yourself into that one. Maybe he's a guy we look back in a couple years and say, oh, the Nets could have had him. I could see that name being one of those guys. Right. But in general, it's not like the list is so deep after the Nets picks filled with guys. Maybe you like Najee. I mean, there are other dudes here. Maybe Leonard Miller. He's another one. There are a few other guys, but in general, I don't have too much buyer remorse here.
No, it's funny. So it's actually really good when you look at the players behind, as you mentioned. It's interesting because just heading into it, I'll give the person the credit when I get the chance. They had thrown up a list of players asking about what are your opinion on. We actually were both interacting on this question around Sasser, around Shepard, around Strother, right? So you go in and you look at these guys and they go 25, 26, and 29. You mentioned Nick Smith Jr., that's not really going to make a difference to me as far as if you could have taken him or not. And same thing with Sasser. When I went and looked at him a little bit, I thought, no, that's not a guy that I would want the Nets to look at, especially in the first round here. But Shepard, interesting. And then when I looked at Strother, I actually thought, oh, like, this is a guy, when you start to look at his game, I actually can see me liking as a fit for the Nets. When you mentioned Leonard Miller, the other part of this is too, just in terms of where the board had been coming into it versus where it landed in a lot of ways. When you have Leonard going, Kobe Jones had been listed in the first round, but it seemed like maybe he was destined to fall. There are a handful of names that you expected definitely being in the first round, and there was just kind of this switch. From 25 to 30, it went from being this group of guys to a different set of players that went there. I think that speaks to the relative range and value and team needs that guys want to, different organizations want to go with. And you just say, this is what we like, and we're going to go that direction. So because there's a mixed bag behind the Nets, it's easier to say, yeah, that's why you shouldn't be overly critical about the direction the Nets went. However, this is the more interesting part. Where were Noah Clowney and Dariq Whitehead on other people's boards? Because the Clowney piece, I think, is the big one. Because I could make a case that he would have been on the board all the way back till the end of the first round, potentially. For Whitehead, I think he falls into this interesting group of, because of the injury, obviously, where you could have seen him flip in or out with some other names and players. But I think he's the type of value based on the pedigree there that someone would have taken him in and around that range. And you probably, if you move back, potentially, you can't get him. Clowney is the reason why I look and go, there's a world where you were able to do something here. And you see no other moves were able to be made. I think there's a world where Sean Marks could have made a specific type of move and still gotten Clowney if that was the Nets guy.
Really funny because I was going to go the other way on that. I was going to say that Whitehead was the guy that maybe you could have had a way later because of the injury stuff, and Clowney might have just ended up going this range just sort of on the measurables, right? But either way, it's impossible to know. But I do think what this speaks to is something I sort of started mentioning, or we both started mentioning at the beginning of the draft, which was it's still kind of shocking to me that this is all that happened for them, right? 21, 22, and 54. Or is that what 54? Is that what they did?
51.
It doesn't matter. I'm going to waste time. 51, 21, 21, 22, and 51. And that was it. After like this, is Royce O'Neal going to move? Is Dorian Finney-Smith going to move? And these pieces are wrapped into what we were just saying, because if we both think that some of these guys might have fallen to like closer to 30, if just on other people's boards, was there an opportunity to move down in this draft? Is there a temperature taking that could have been done that would have said these guys, one of these two guys is going to be available later and we can get an asset or get off an asset by like moving down, or, getting off one of these contracts or something like that. I mean, it's not the same.
Well, let's go a layer deeper on that in a second, because I think that's the more expansive conversation here. Let's just not forget to mention Jalen Wilson, 51st pick, second round. They do go get this kid. Now, to be clear, as we always say, second round picks, they are dart throws. You're taking a chance on a guy. Good news is every time that I listed a name that I thought the Nets should keep an eye on in the second round, they got drafted 5 or 6 picks sooner, right? Had a great discussion around Jalen Pickett and whether or not he's a little bit older. Maybe the Nets could target how far up. He went 32, so that was pretty quick. Amari Barely was another guy. No, off the board. So they end up going with Jalen Wilson. And again, this is a high-level view. We'll dive into him a little bit more here out of Kansas. So obviously there is a level of confidence around the level that he plays at a college. Some guys, smaller market teams, you think about whether or not some of these stats can be padded. Good shooter, good three-point shooter. Don't love the fact that his free throw percentage, is a little bit low. Doesn't really play particularly above the rim. I like, at least as a guy you're going to take a look at this. He makes sense. Fundamentally sound player. You can bring him in. You can develop him. I'm going to keep it there because anything more than that, I think, would be disingenuous. But I don't mind this pick for the Nets, and they bring another forward into the room, which is important for them.
Yeah, look, older dude, probably like pretty much know what you're getting and hope that like maybe the 3-point shooting improves just enough to stay on the court, right? Like I think that's kind of what you're kind of hoping for. You hope the defense can just be more than just a speed bump, right? This is kind of what you're getting. I hate to just sound middle of the road on this guy, but 22 years old, you're getting close to being fully realized, at least as your college self. So you should, if you have any skills at all, you should at least be scoring at that point. He did, right? He did at Kansas. So I think that he showed some of that. I think there's just like nothing that really pops, but sometimes the good news on guys like this is like, you don't need everything to pop. You just need everything to not be terrible. And he kind of fits into that mold, right? It's like, there's nothing egregiously bad here. There's nothing insanely good either. And at that point, for the Nets who might be trading one of these wings at some point, I mean, we keep hearing about this, maybe it'll happen. He is a guy that you could see, like he at least projects size-wise and some of the skill stuff to be to be more than like some of the younger guys like Raekwon Gray, right? Like, or these other David Duke
Which
Jr.
are hard
even,
to like think about developing into X, right?
It's like it's David Duke Jr. I hate to like throw a stray here at him, but it's like hard to know exactly what it's gonna be, right? Because it's like a little too small for this and a little, not, you know, little. There's always like a little
too
not
slow
enough
for X or Y.
Yeah, it's like not enough. But like, I think that like a guy like Jalen here is a little different in that it might just all be just enough to play at the NBA level, right? So I think like that's sort of my bird's eye view of it.
And by the way, at 51, that's good. Have a guy that could just be enough to be a contributor at the NBA level is a good thing to have in a prospect as a baseline. Now, coming up here in a second, let's dive in on the other possibilities of what could have happened, maybe what should have happened for Sean Marks and the Nets on draft night. Okay, quick reminder too, mentioned there in the last segment, David Duke Jr. That's actually going to come up here in what will be our next episode, discussing other moves the Nets can make, the backcourt. How do we feel about it? How does it seem the Nets maybe feel about it? And are there players they could go out and trade for, look at on the market? Or how do they feel about a lot of these in-house guys now that they're turning over a newer and slightly younger leaf? That being the case, man, I going back to the network mock drafts when we ran through it, and there was a little bit of chaos in there. Shout out to Locked On Magic. They kind of went for it in a big way, and it was fun. But specifically from the Nets standpoint, whether or not you judge it as I had made a trade with network guru and founder David Locke with the Jazz to move back from 21 to 28 and dump the Patty Mills contract. Now you can say the Nets didn't move that far back to do it, or they should have tried to move Joe Harris's contract, whatever the case may be. I think that may be one of my biggest critiques. Could you, or did you want to move up the board? Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, targeted player. If that option isn't there, it's not there, right? Teams aren't clamoring for it. But when you start to look at the way this board broke in the 20s, and you start to think about how it does feel very fluid from 20 all the way through 30, I don't know if it would have been hard to twist the arm of a team and say, we'll come back a few spots and we'll make sure we get some money off the books here. Because as it stands right now, the Nets have a lot of work to do when you think about occupying, $40-ish million between 3-4 players, including Joe Harris, that maybe should not be here by the time you go to the season. Doesn't mean it can't get done, but I would have liked the idea of trying to explore that on draft night.
Yeah, we saw an example of this. I mean, it's a little easier near the top of the draft when the pieces are a little more solidified into where they're going to go, because we saw Dallas get off of the Davis Bertans contract by basically trading down 2 spots, right? Mm-hmm. With the Thunder, they shed the Bertans contract, the Thunder take Cason Wallace, and then the Mavericks get their guy with Derek Lively just 2 picks later, right? They felt very confident that they could get off the thing. And that allows the Thunder, like everyone sort of wins in that scenario, right? Like the Thunder gets some money on the books that they get to move up and make sure they take their guy, blah, blah, blah. It's like that kind of scenario on a lower level that you're sort of talking about with the Nets, I think, right? It's like move down, feel confident. And look, we don't know. Like sometimes the deals aren't there, right? This is like it lined up because you had 2 teams that knew exactly what they wanted. And like a small difference with this is, like with Cason Wallace, let's say, you just know he's not going to be there later. Like, right. Like he's not going to make it past a certain number. With these other guys, Clowney, Dariq Whitehead, or whoever some of these other teams have projected in the 20s, it does feel like a lot of times those teams are taking their guy. Right. And so it's a little hard to know exactly who would have fallen there. I'm totally with you though. Like this is where, again, just walking into out of the draft with just the same pieces. I just wonder sometimes if the asking prices are too high in these guys that's just,
we heard that going in, right?
And they don't represent the reality. Again, trade deadline, Seth Curry still on the team. Royce, all these guys still on the team. Like they shouldn't have been, right? This should have been a total sell-off at the trade deadline. They didn't do it. And now they're still not doing it. And I just always wondering, sort of like, I'm continually wondering, like, what is the plan? Because it feels like Marks is coming and going at the same time. And there's like a 2-headed approach. And those 2 heads don't really seem to have anything to do with each other.
That's a really good. Yeah. I'm of 2 minds and neither one of them agrees. I think that's actually my biggest critique. So overall, my closing thought around this draft, and we graded the picks. We graded about maybe what they could have done. If I'm grading Sean Marks, it's what exactly is the intention here? Now, again, there's still time for more things to happen. But when you take, so if I want to look at it positively, you keep Dorian Finney-Smith, you keep Royce O'Neal, you draft 2 young players, one who needs time to develop and one who's going to have to take a look at this injury and see where he is. So having these veterans ahead of them does make sense, right? Because you still want to be competitive and you don't want to send out Mikal Bridges with, we assume, Cameron Johnson coming back and then Noah Clowney being into the rotation and saying there's going to be growing pains here. So you're trying to serve that function of wanting to stay competitive, wanting to be a team that believes they can go back and make the playoffs next season. I don't know if you can do that. I don't know if that's the smartest approach here versus saying, we know there may be lumps that we will take in the short term, but how much longer do we push the timeline here of making sure that these guys do develop? A lot of decisions around other young players on this roster. So in that sense, like, if Sean Marks and the Nets do have a clear vision, and if I'm trying to glean it from this, it's that they set a really high bar on the price tag for these players because they didn't really want to move them. They didn't really want to move off of Dorian Finney-Smith. They understand the perception of why they should, but unless it got them up to 10, unless it was a package with a pick there to really go get a targeted player, they were going to come right back into this season with the same thing they came out of the deadline with. Dorian Finney-Smith in the starting lineup, Royce O'Neal as critical bench rotation player, versatile guy, Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, Nicholas Claxton, and some young guys that they want to continue to develop and grow. And I think there's moves to be made here in the backcourt. But, and I'll even encapsulate it in another piece, so many fans were calling for time to move off Spencer Dinwiddie, $20 million, final year, not all guaranteed. Guess what? They didn't bring him back in the Dallas Mavericks trade for nothing. Like, they didn't do it just for the fun of it. I think, again, they want him to be back a part of this fold at the highest level as he was down the stretch of the season. Maybe not, but maybe there is a little bit more of a standing pat in the short term for Brooklyn than we either perceived or preferred as they came into the draft.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of what I mean. It's like, what, are there 2 separate plans here? Is there like that we need to get younger, but we're also still kind of waiting for Dame sort of plan? Because like not trading these guys would line up with the looking to still kind of go for it with a splash, and we need some NBA ready wings to be able to do it.
I did know very quickly. I did send out a very cryptic tweet late last night at one point where I said, I don't think the Nets, agenda is fully complete here. And I didn't mean it to be so. They're like, what does that mean? Whatever. I was like, I just don't look at these 2 draft picks and still having these other veteran players and say, this is it. And while we think that Damian Lillard conversation should be all but done, I did speak, by the way, with Robin Lundberg while I was at the draft coverage last night and kind of reading the tea leaves around. Yes, at a very high price point, it's hard to look at Damian Lillard as being viable. But if all of a sudden we're talking 2 first-round picks and some players to get Damian Lillard, yeah, you at least understand why the Nets are entertaining or willing to go down that road if they know Portland, they're not getting Mikal Bridges, right? So there is still this little tiny door opening around what this all is for the Brooklyn Nets.
Well, right, because the second you sell off Royce, you trade Royce O'Neal and Dorian Finney-Smith, like you can't make a functional case to go get Damian Lillard, right?
Exactly.
Like you can't, once you've done those things, the ship has sailed for you on making a functional case even to him, right? Let's say if he has a part of the process of where he wants to go, like you're not gonna be able to sell that anymore. So this is what I mean by having 2 heads. Like they're just like, these are 2 separate, these are 2 totally separate. Now, sort of like you at some point you do need to get younger, you need to get cheaper, you need to have rookie contracts on the books. And so like they were probably gonna have to do that anyway. And it's like a little bit of a hedge against these 2 things that can happen. But it just feels like that's probably it. And I'll close with that. It's like it just feels like a hedge. And that's where I land with a C+ grade. It's that like everything has another thing in mind.
Yeah.
And that's going to be hard. That's going to be hard to plan for because you can't fully do one thing.
And in some ways you're chasing 3 agendas, right? A potential star pursuit agenda, a steady as it goes, veteran based team competitive agenda, and a young agenda. And you can do some of these things simultaneously, but it's hard to execute thoughtful plans well if you're trying to serve every possible path here. The hedge, you said it, hedging. At this point of the franchise, I don't like that, right? I don't like the hedge now. You don't have to do that anymore. We'll see where it goes from here, obviously.
Just a quick programming note too, or a quick note. Spencer Dinwiddie's contract is fully guaranteed for this year.
Oh, yeah, excuse me, because by the way, we did investigate that early. Investigate it. We looked it up after he played a certain amount of games. It locked all
50.
that money in. People were wondering about that. Full 20 mil.
50 games last year, and he was locked in. Okay, We're going to get out of here. We'll be back again tomorrow. We're going to talk a little bit about this point guard situation, line up a team that might have some excess in that positional department. In the meantime, make sure you are subscribed to Locked On Nets over on YouTube. Big love to everybody that was there draft night. I mean, so many people in there firing questions, super excited. It was a great time. So really appreciative. Make sure you are in on the action too. Go subscribe to Locked On Nets on YouTube.
Great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people. Ellie Roosevelt.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.